Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss an emerging threat to billions of people. But first, I recently spoke with Dr. Jacqui Frost, postdoctoral scholar at Rice University, who will be moving soon to Purdue University, about her recent paper titled Ritualizing Nonreligion: Cultivating Rational Rituals in Secular Spaces. The paper is to be published in Social Forces and is sole-authored. Before I get to the interview, if you're watching this on YouTube, I have 3 brief requests to make and 1 offer to extend. My requests: if you like the show or episode, please like, subscribe, and comment. My offer: if you want to receive no more than 1 email a week with a link to the new TWiSP episode, click the link in the description and then enter your email address. By doing this, you assure you will be notified about new TWiSP episodes no more than once a week via email. Thanks. Now, on with the interview. Dr. Frost, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, the title of your paper is Ritualizing Nonreligion. Before we move to non-religion, what are the elements of religion, so I can sort of have a sense of the contrast, or what's the difference between what we think of as a religion and what you're going to be studying?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I don't know that we as sociologists have actually fully answered yet. We have sort of a number of different ways of thinking about what a religion is. I would say there's 2 primary orientations. So one would be sort of a Durkheimian perspective on religion, which is sort of what is the function of religion. So often those definitions of religion are, religion helps you create community, religion sustains beliefs in, supernatural powers or whatever it might be. Versus a more sort of Weberian definition of religion is more about the substance of that belief. So that those definitions would be more often about do you believe in a supernatural power, or do you attend, a church? So in terms of thinking about religion versus non-religion, oftentimes, we think of religious people as having some sort of supernatural belief and non-religious people as not having those beliefs. But it gets a little more complicated if you think about sort of a more functional version of religion where, non-religious people, as we'll talk about today, they engage in rituals. They often go to church-like spaces. So they often do a lot of the things that religious people do. And so I think especially those of us who are studying non-religious communities, we're really grappling with those definitions. And there's a lot of different types of non-religious people, and they have different beliefs. So my answer is I think it's complicated to start, I guess.
So it's rather than a sharp divide between religion and non-religion, it's more like a sort of a continuum.
Yeah.
With shades of in different dimensions for some groups, and if they have enough of those dimensions, that would put them in the religious.
Right.
The more they have, the more they look like a religion. But having only a few could still be a religion, or having a few could be.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it in terms like sort of a spectrum of here's ways that people make meaning out of their lives. Some use religious aspects more than others. But again, it's also, who's defining religion. Some sociologists do define religion as has a belief in a supernatural power. And in that way, non-religious people wouldn't be on that same sort of continuum. But I sort of operate on this because some non-religious people do have some supernatural beliefs, just not necessarily in theological beings. And so it can get kind of tricky. But yeah, spectrum is a good way to think about it.
It sounds well, so that's a fascinating discussion to go into, but I'd like to also ask, and maybe we'll come back to some of the things you just were talking about, is your paper is focusing on ritual. And so the first thing I wondered about is what counts as a ritual, or maybe more what defines a ritual? Because what counts as a ritual might be as complex as what counts as a religion.
Right. Yeah. So I typically use Catherine Bell, who's a ritual scholar. Her definition is like ritualization, or, you know, making something a ritual is sort of the intentional distinguishing of certain actions or objects as being distinct and sort of imbued with special meaning or sacred meaning. And so the ritual is sort of the process of celebrating that sacred object or belief, or marking it, or, you know, bringing about experiences around that, I would say. And while most, you know, historically, ritual in sociology has typically been studied as religious rituals, people tend to think of ritual as religious, or as at least being sort of related to religion. Durkheim was actually the first to sort of say, like, you know, rituals are sort of a human action. It doesn't have to be religious. And so you can have rituals that are religious, but we have a lot of secular rituals too, right? Like, you know, presidential inaugurations or, you know, weddings are often secular. So I would say mostly, you know, setting an event or an object or a belief apart as special or sacred, and sort of having a practice around that would be how I define ritual.
So what leads you to focus on non-religion in your study of ritual, and who's taking it up and how they take it up?
Yeah, so this paper came out of my larger dissertation project on atheist churches. And so I've been studying non-religious groups for a long time. And in sort of the mid 2000s, there was this big sort of social movement around destigmatizing atheists in the United States. And so there were a lot of books written, there were a lot of debates had about sort of what is atheism, are atheists good people, those kinds of things. If you've seen, depends on what state you're in, but there are a lot of billboard campaigns around this. You see like a big billboard that says good without God or sleep in on Sundays. As sort of some of these like larger national atheist organizations have these campaigns to sort of an identity politics around atheism and destigmatizing it. And so I was doing work in that area, thinking about, you know, what does it mean to be an atheist in the United States? And, you know, in sort of the public opinion, but also in sociology, there's a lot of stereotypes about what non-religious people believe and do and think. And there's, especially in our sort of larger narratives about secularization, there's this sort of general assumption that when we lose religion, like if a society loses religion in a way that the United States is in some ways. So over the last 20 years, we've seen a huge increase in the number of people who report that they're not religiously affiliated. So that was about, you know, maybe 5% in the 1980s, and we're at 30% of people in the US being non-religious in some capacity now. So I've been studying this sort of transition for a long time. And one thing that came up to me was this belief that non-religious people, once you leave religion, that there's nothing there. There's no beliefs, there's no communities, there's no meaning making. It's all sort of rational, intellectual, secular spaces. And so my dissertation was on this network of atheist churches, which really sort of disprove a lot of these assumptions. So this is atheists meeting on Sunday mornings. They meet in, you know, sometimes in church spaces, but sort of in buildings wherever they can find. They sing songs together, usually pop songs. They have speakers come and talk about science or lifestyle type topics, or, you know, social justice type topics. They have potlucks. They have small group meetings throughout the week. So this is essentially everything that you would find in a church, but it's all sort of non-religious. It's explicitly atheist. And so as part of the ethnography that I did with this organization, a big piece of atheist church is rituals. And so they are borrowing from religious rituals in some cases, or they're creating their own rituals based in sort of their atheist values. And in doing that, I was reading about, you know, what makes a ritual, how do rituals get created? And there's a lot of sociological research that assumes that non-religious people aren't interested in rituals because rituals are sort of conflated with religion. Rituals are assumed to be sort of not amenable to sort of rational thinking. We tend to think that rituals need to be taken for granted, like they need to be this sort of long-standing tradition, and people aren't supposed to be able to see the construction of the ritual, or otherwise it won't work, is often sort of the common narrative about rituals. And so what I found at the Sunday Assembly, which is this atheist church that I studied, is that the non-religious are very interested in rituals, and they use sort of a rationalistic worldview to create rituals. And so that's sort of where this paper came out of. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's good. But So what really does make a ritual? Because I'm trying to figure out what's the difference between, um, I can tell a story of, every when I sit down to work, I have to have, my coffee, and so I have a set of activities I do to make the coffee. It changes over time. Right now, I'm making cold brew these days, so I do that. Grind the beans. Well, forget about buying the beans, but grind the beans. Put them in the container, measure out what you need, and so forth and so on. So, what is it that makes that a ritual or makes it not a ritual? I mean, that's what I'm trying to figure out, because I do this on a regular basis. It's connected to the meaning. I mean, I don't know if this is true, but I mean, how I feel about it is it's connected to the meaning. It's almost like, without my coffee, I have writer's block. If I don't, the idea that I would sit here writing and there would be nothing in this little place I put the coffee that keeps it warm. I mean, I don't think it's almost like I'll look in the room and see, oh, my coffee cup's not here, and run down when I could just come in and sit down. So I'm trying to figure out what is it that makes, I mean, that's an example. I'm sure everyone has these things in their lives. Does that not rise to the level of ritual? And if not, why not? I'm not really concerned about deciding is it a ritual or not, as much as I am figuring out what is it about it that would make it a ritual or make it not a ritual?
Well, I think my answer would be that it's about the meaning that you give to it, right? So I don't drink coffee, I drink tea most days. But I would call that more of a routine in my life than a ritual, I guess, in that it's something I do regularly, but I don't find a lot of meaning from it. I find caffeine from it. But, versus, my friend makes coffee in a much more ritualistic manner. There's, it's a process, and it's about aesthetics, and it's about, thinking about coffee production, or whatever it might be. So in that case, I could see that being more ritualistic. And so I think for me, the piece that makes it a ritual, and again, I'm not like a ritual scholar necessarily, I'm more of a non-religion scholar, but I would say that it's about that sort of sacred meaning, right? Or even, it doesn't have to be sacred, but special meaning, right? So for you, maybe making the coffee, drinking the coffee process has something that's not profane, right? It's more sacred, it's special, it's something that's set apart for you, versus just a routine, which is something you do every day. And that if you don't do it, you're sort of out of whack, but it's not something that's like a special meaning. And so in these spaces, they are intentionally trying to cultivate specific kinds of emotions and specific kinds of group interactions with these rituals in ways that wouldn't happen with just a routine, I think.
Okay, just one more thing on this, one more element on this. It sounds like the meaning has to be in some sense positive. Because there are, I mean, anyway, because I don't, I mean, that may not be true, but I'm just thinking if it's up to the person to imbue it with meaning, it seems, and that makes sense to me. That two people might be doing exactly the same thing, but for one it's a ritual and for the other it's a routine.
Right. That's a really interesting question about whether a ritual has to be positive. And I think my first instinct would be to say no, but I'm trying to think of what a ritual around a negative emotion might be. I can think of rituals to sort of rid yourself of negative feelings or experiences, or rituals around, sacrifice, maybe, which would be negative for the object being sacrificed, I guess. But yeah, I would have to think through that more. But what's interesting to me about that question is sort of, and maybe we'll talk about this a little later in this episode, but a big piece of my findings is sort of around ritual failure, and around the idea that, especially in these atheist churches, they're creating new rituals from scratch in a lot of examples. And a lot of times they fail the first, the fifth, the 50th time they try it. And so most ritual scholars would say that will elicit negative emotions, and that people don't like failed rituals. Randall Collins says that they don't generate emotional energy. And so if you experience a failed ritual, then you're less likely to continue in that community or in that ritual practice or whatever it might be. But what I found is that that's not the case, at least not in my case study. The idea was to go in expecting failure because it's new, because they're trying new things, but also because they're drawing on their sort of extreme faith in science and the scientific method. And so they say, well, I read this research study that says if we sing the same song collectively, that will induce oxytocin. And that will create collective effervescence. So we know science says that this will work. And so if we do it enough times, if we do it the right way, it will work eventually. And so in that process of creation and trial and error, they find that's how they actually built the community, that I watched them build community through the sort of failure and testing out and trying and sort of the vulnerability that comes in, especially failing at a ritual together. For some people that was too awkward and they left. But for most of the people there, it was something that bonded them together. And I think that's the interesting thing about my findings that are different from most scholarship on rituals. Most scholarship on ritual is about the successful rituals and what they do. And we assume that a failed ritual is just a negative experience. But that's not necessarily the case.
They're drawing on their previous experiences to suggest things, or they're drawing on the science to suggest things. Who is in this a Sunday assembly? That's who's in the Sunday assembly.
Yeah, so the Sunday Assembly is an interesting case. It's not the only atheist church in the U.S. There are, I don't know how many, but there are a dozen or so different organizations that are doing a similar kind of thing where they meet on Sundays and sort of replicate a church for non-religious people. And it's different than something like a Unitarian church. I often get the question of how is this different than a Unitarian Universalist church? There's a lot of similarities, but the Unitarians are often more of an interfaith organization. So if you attend one of their services, you can be an atheist and find meaning there, but they're sort of, they have rituals for all religious and non-religious faiths, whereas Sunday Assembly is explicitly about and for non-religious people, not just atheists, but people who don't have any sort of religious beliefs or practices for the most part. And so the people going are typically explicitly non-religious. They also tend to be white middle-class professionals in 30s to 60s range. I would say it's not a very young age group, but it's also not necessarily that in sort of the older range. I do a lot of work in sort of what I call the non-religious field, which is sort of the field of organizations one could be involved in. And there's a lot of political atheist organizations, like the ones putting out the billboards that I mentioned earlier, that are really pushing this identity politics, but are also sort of in some ways defining what it means to be an atheist for people that maybe don't agree with their stance on what it means to be an atheist. And they're also not explicitly about community building. They're about politics and legislation. And so the Sunday Assembly was created out of this sort of felt need in the non-religious space for a more communal-based space for people to go. So a lot of the people that I talked to at Sunday Assembly would be like, oh yeah, I went to X atheist organization and I'm all for them trying to keep church and state separated, but I'm not making friends there. I'm interested in living a good life as a non-religious person and sort of creating values and rituals around that with other people. And so that's the people that are going there to Sunday Assembly are interested in those things. But again, it's being borrowed from the church model that they're replicating is a very sort of white Protestant church model. And so that resonates with a certain demographic as well.
So I have to ask this question I'll ask two questions. One is the Sunday Assembly anti-religion? And then connected to that is whatever the answer to that, what is its philosophy? Is it just, it could be as simple as everybody show up, or there might be some content. And so that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
So, but the first is more fundamental because for people to understand, it's maybe an organization not many people know about it. They're going to wonder, is it explicitly hostile to religion?
Right. Yeah. It is explicitly not hostile to religion. And because of what I was just talking about, this sort of this felt need after going to these political organizations, which are often anti-religious. And a lot of the sort of public-facing atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, those were the authors publishing in the mid-2000s that started this sort of social movement wave, but they are still extremely anti-religious. And most of the non-religious people I encounter in my field work are not anti-religious. And so they go to these political spaces, they read these books, they see atheist views represented in the media, and they are often very anti-religious. And most non-religious people don't want to be anti-religious. They have religious friends and family. They see, value in certain religious beliefs and practices. They are often critical of religion, and they are not themselves religious. So Sunday Assembly is very much a space about, they call themselves radically inclusive, in that they want everyone, even religious people, to feel welcome to come, but with the knowledge that what will be discussed is explicitly secular, and promoting secular beliefs and values, as a positive thing to have. And so there's Sunday Assembly is sort of trying to push back against some of the anti-religious organizations and be a space for positive, like creating positive beliefs and values, rather than a lot of what people will say is like, people think of atheism as sort of this rejection identity. And in some ways it is that. But the Sunday Assembly is really about creating what is the substance of our belief beyond just rejecting religion. And so that's where the rituals come in, and the sort of collective singing, and the sort of, I wouldn't say worship, but celebrating science and scientists and scientific findings in their services. So it's more about the positive than it is about what it is they're rejecting. Go ahead. Yeah.
No,
go ahead. I was going to answer your second question, but then I was going to ask what it was because I couldn't remember.
Okay. Well, the second question was, with that radical inclusivity, do they have some content in their philosophy, it's a catchphrase or something that summarizes what they're trying to do, or text they point to or something?
Yeah, it's very minimal. So their catchphrase or their motto is help often, live better, wonder more. And so that's sort of the extent of what they will say. So I went to a big conference they had with a bunch of Sunday Assembly organizers going, and they're sort of debating, what is it that we stand for? What should our mission be? That kind of thing. And most of the sort of consensus is the thing about religion they don't want to replicate is handing down a set moral standard, or handing down, here are the rules we live by, because that can create dogma in a way that they don't agree with. And they also are concerned about the more sort of anti-religious atheist spaces that are dogmatic in their own ways, about non-religion. And so they're very concerned about sort of walking that line of being inclusive, of being positive, of being, a space for people to come be positive non-religious people. And so that has meant that there's not a lot of overarching shared sort of tenets, I would say, in any way, which, has caused issues, lots of debates. But yeah.
Well, I guess if you're founding it in science is a vast enterprise covering, the microorganisms all the way up to, the largest stage entities in the universe. So it's kind of makes sense that maybe it's hard to nail down a specific.
Right. And their worldview is sort of scientifically oriented. And in science, it's all about never, continuing to seek out truth and never assuming that you've come to that truth necessarily. Right. And so that ethos sort of permeates everything that they do, including creating rituals. Right. And so they use science in this sort of, it'll work once we use the right formula mentality, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. So what about, was there any expressions of, so I understand that the organization and the seeking of rituals were to create some things, to give people certain kinds of experiences. What came out of that? When a ritual was successful, how did people talk about it? Or was there any talk about it? Or did they even reference it as successful?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so, I was doing ethnography with this space, going to their services every Sunday, but also interviewing people during this process. And so I would often, after what I thought was observed as a sort of successful ritual on a Sunday, whoever I was interviewing later that week, I would talk to about that and see how they felt about it. But there were a lot of examples of successful rituals. I mean, that could look like a lot of things, like it took, for example, so I studied just one chapter out of 70 of this organization. And so in that chapter, it took a couple months for the collective singing to take hold. And there's an interesting discussion to be had about sort of the regional success of these chapters. I was in the Midwest, and Midwesterners aren't famous for liking to stand up and sing loudly together. So I think, versus like the LA chapter I went to a couple times was like a big show. There were hundreds of people there. So that's sort of a sidetrack thing. But so successful rituals at the chapter I went to was sort of, when the collective singing actually started, people would actually stand up and sing together. One time we were singing You've Got a Friend in Me from Toy Story. And I saw people, two friends hugged each other during the middle of the song, and I talked to them after, and they said, oh, it just brought out these emotions of like friendship in me, like those kinds of experiences. Or we would have, I say we very loosely, I went a lot, so I felt part of the organization. They would have, readings. They read.
But that's the ethnographic method.
Yes.
To really do it well, you have to be part of the.
Yeah. I was actually part of the organizing team. I was their minutes taker. I was their secretary because I was taking notes anyways. And they were like, can you type these up for us? So anyways, so, the singing started to work more in ways that like people expressed they felt the collective effervescence, or they felt sort of an individual sort of, they had an emotional experience with a song, or, there would be readings. So one day they read the Robert Frost poem, The Road Diverged in a Wood. I can't remember what the title of it is. But the person sitting next to me got chills, and they like rubbed their arm and like told me that they got chills, so like those sort of moments of like, oh, I felt connected to people in the group, or, oh, like I had an emotional response to that reading, are examples, I think, of sort of that successfully working. One time we were playing a game of rock, paper, scissors, where it's everyone plays against somebody else, and then the person that loses has to cheer on the person that wins. And so eventually everyone's cheering on one of two people, if that makes sense. And so by the end of that game, there was a lot of excitement and collective effervescence around the game, but also it was sort of early in the process of forming the community. And so people were really excited about like, oh, these can be my new friends. Everyone's having fun. So those would be examples of successful rituals in the moment. But I think it also, a lot of people that went to Sunday Assembly for a year or two talked about how they were more interested in rituals because of their experience there. So they sought out rituals outside of Sunday Assembly, like they would go on more nature walks, or they started meditating. So not only was, their successful rituals in the moment there, but I do think that this space sort of showed a lot of non-religious people that they could have rituals in their lives as secular people, and sort of taught them how that could work. So
does this, I guess the closing question is, as you reflect on your work, I mean, what is it saying anything about, certainly studying the non-religious organization, people attending the services, or I don't know if we should call them services, the meetings, but that's important, and I want to get your take on anything you take away from that. But I'm also wondering, is ritual necessary? I mean, do humans, is it something humans need? I mean, not, obviously necessary might be too strong, but is it something that is just a universal aspect of human experience, or having it enhances every human's experience, or is it just falls on deaf ears, right? In other words, what's the position of humans in relation to this idea of ritual?
Yeah. I've been thinking about that a lot, and I don't know exactly where I've landed. But I think I would say no, ritual is not necessary to have a meaningful life. And I did interview a lot of non-religious people who are not interested in ritual. And so this paper, I focused explicitly on like the people that were interested in it, and how that process sort of worked, because I think we hadn't really theorized non-religious rituals. But I think I could write a whole separate paper on the people I interviewed that were very against ritualization of any kind. And a lot of that had to do with their bad experiences with religion in the past. And so they would talk about, I always see ritual as sort of mind games, like that, or they think about rituals as being processes that create boundaries around groups and beliefs in a way that they don't like anymore. And they want to be open-minded. They want, to and so a lot of non-religious people, some of the biggest critics of this atheist church idea are other atheists, because they see there could be potential problems in ritualizing things in this way. And so, yeah, I think, a lot of sociologists would say that rituals are distinctly human activity and that we can't have life without them. And I think to some extent, yes, we need, like we were talking about earlier, we need routines, right? And we need habits. But to the extent that we need to make those routines sacred, I don't think that everyone has that impulse or need. And I talk to a lot of people who don't. And so I'm also interested in pushing forward the idea that, like, even if when you lose religion, you lose ritual, that doesn't necessarily mean you lose meaning.
Yes. Well, Dr. Frost, it's a fascinating analysis, and I'm looking forward to learning more. And I appreciate the hard work you did. Ethnography is one of the most difficult things to do, but it seems like the way to get at these insights. And so I appreciate you doing the work, and I appreciate you coming on and sharing it with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Our final segment concerns an emerging threat to billions of people. The July 7th Washington Post article headline read, "India's deadly heat wave will soon be a global reality." Scientists infer that this high humidity heat wave foreshadows our future, and that inference is bolstered by recent research showing that the Indian heat wave is only an intensification of conditions that had been occurring unbeknownst to scientists for a long time now. The conditions are a combination of high heat and high humidity. The article states that lay researchers have long known that humans can withstand very high heat in low humidity conditions. It reports on an experimenter from the 1700s who tolerated up to 240 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees hotter than the boiling point of water. However, on April 5th, 1905, J.S. Haldane descended into a tin mine to conduct additional research. In the high humidity of the mine, Haldane could withstand only 88.7 degrees Fahrenheit after 3 hours, as his body temperature and pulse rose to dangerous levels. The reason for the difference? Humans cool their bodies by sweating. The sweat reaches the skin, and under most conditions it then evaporates. The evaporation of the sweat takes the heat away, cooling the person. However, in the high humidity mine, as the heat rose, the sweat was unable to evaporate. Consequently, the heat was not dissipated. The wet bulb temperature is a measure of the temperature of an object that can be achieved through evaporative cooling, assuming good airflow and that the ambient air temperature remains the same. The Washington Post article states that for a healthy person doing physical activities, a few hours exposure to a wet bulb temperature of 88.7 degrees Fahrenheit can be fatal. For a healthy person not engaging in physical activity with access to unlimited shade and water, a few hours exposure to a wet bulb index of 95 degrees Fahrenheit can result in death. Historically, such conditions were concentrated in places where one has a large source of water that could be heated in the summer, and the potential for a sea breeze to bring the humid air inland over a heated continental geography. And even then, the conditions would not last long. The harrowing conclusion of the recent research, however, is that decades ago, more spots on the globe began to meet these conditions. However, the limited data and tendency to smooth raw data across reporting stations led scientists to miss the change. Now, as even more of the globe is becoming susceptible to these climatic conditions, billions of people are becoming vulnerable. It is that conclusion that leads scientists to see the heat wave in India as an illustration of what awaits us on a warming planet. Last month, at various times, the heat at one station reached 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit with a relative humidity of 80%. If those conditions occur simultaneously, it would produce a wet bulb index of 92.9 degrees Fahrenheit, substantially above the 88.7 degree threshold for activity. In the past, scientists had expected these conditions to become possible late in this century, perhaps by 2075. Thus, we are, at minimum, 50 years ahead of expectation. The social implications of this phenomena and the pathways to and from its occurrence are many. Consider some of the dynamics. First, in the short term, as we know, a high wet bulb temperature reflects the existence of high humidity and high heat, and under those conditions, humans are unable to dissipate the heat and cool down, and this can lead to negative health impacts, and if it's over a wide area, it will lead to mass fatalities. Factors that intensify this process would be old age or youth, as well as poverty. People respond to these conditions, if they're able, by using local air conditioning. This has a couple of impacts that are problematic. One, for example, is that air conditioners poured out heat in the nearby area. This heat will add to the heat that is causing the original problem and could then trickle down to lead to more health impacts. So this is a positive feedback loop in the sense of the mitigation effort actually increases more the need for more mitigation. It also can tax the electrical grid if there are too many people attempting to use this local air conditioning. So the power could go out, which would leave many more humans vulnerable to the high wet bulb temperature, leaving them unable to dissipate heat and cool down, additional health impacts on more people, and again, increasing the number of deaths. There are other more social impacts. In the one social impact is the short-term labor shortfall. If people are ill owing to heat stroke, there are going to be fewer people able to do the work that needs to be done. One impact of this is that should the electrical grid go down, there might be fewer people with the knowledge available to repair the electrical system. Another impact is that if there are people unable to work in the fields because just aren't as many people as otherwise expected, the harvest may decline. This can lead to hunger and famine, which independently can lead to more fatalities. Another important pathway that's social is that if there's a short-term labor shortfall, shipping and trade would be reduced. The inability to move food across borders itself can lead to hunger and famine, or exacerbate hunger and famine and end up producing more mass fatalities. Another important social pathway involves migration. When people are this is a more long-term likely impact, but if there's certain parts of the globe that become constantly or routinely exposed to high wet bulb temperature such that it becomes uninhabitable, it's going to lead to migration. And as people leave, there's going to be increased social conflict and violence in the locations to which they move, or at least that's the expectation. This by itself can lead to more fatalities. Another important pathway, social pathway, is that, if you recall, the original health impacts can be exacerbated for people who are older and for very young children. Well, this can change the age distribution. There will be fewer older people, there will be fewer younger people. And as you go forward in time, that can lead to a long-term labor shortfall, just as the number of the mass fatalities could lead to a long-term labor shortfall. This additionally can cause harvest decline. There are just fewer people able to do the work of even planting, let alone harvesting. And then it can also impair the ability of repairing the electrical grid and other infrastructure, because there's just not as much labor around to maintain the systems that were built in a high labor availability environment. So shipping and trade can also be impacted. If there's fewer people, there might be fewer economic reasons to justify shipping across borders, as well as fewer people to engage in the activity. That by itself impacting hunger and famine and leading to more mass deaths. And then, of course, if there's a long-term labor shortfall, you could lock in the inability of shipping, which would be reflected in a supply chain collapse. And that could affect the harvest by lowering the ability of shipping goods across borders. For example, items needed to repair, spare parts. So as the infrastructure comes under stress and eventually breaks down, that just happens, repairs might be difficult, and that might reduce the harvest. And of course, leading to hunger, famine, and more fatalities, as well as just the supply chain collapsing itself might reduce the ability of shipping food across borders from places that are net exporters to places that are net importers of food. Most of these are social impacts. The intensification of the health impacts by old age and youth is connected to poverty. Those are social impacts. The use of local air conditioning to mitigate the environmental conditions are social factors available to people with wealth, not available to people with poverty, or less available at least. The short-term labor shortfall, the shipping trade reduction, the long-term labor shortfall, all are social interfaces with the climate situation. The movement of people across borders, the social conflict and violence that may follow, those are social pathways through which high wet bulb temperature can have an impact in reducing human flourishing. And then, of course, humid heat, high wet bulb temperature may have negative impacts on animals and plants themselves, independent of any human causal act, and that by itself can lead to harvest decline and decline in foodstuffs. So there are a large number of social factors and places where the social meets the climate that have an impact in perhaps facilitating and exacerbating the increase in fatalities, owing to an increase in the existence of high humidity, high heat conditions. In a breakthrough paper published 2 years ago titled "The Emergence of Heat and Humidity Too Severe for Human Tolerance," Colin Raymond, Tom Matthews, and Radley M. Horton dispelled several reassuring assumptions about the coming age of humidity. At the climatological level, the new news is concerning. Not only is the 95-degree threshold above which an inactive, shaded, naked, fully hydrated person will still risk death a physical possibility, but since 1979, the number of times per year that the threshold has been breached has been increasing. Indeed, the threshold has been breached in, among other places, the United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, India, Australia, Mexico, and Venezuela. Keep in mind that these readings were taken outside. The conditions inside a stuffy building could be more extreme. Concern only grows once we integrate sociological factors into the unfolding risk of fatality. age distributions will be thinned at the youngest and the oldest ages. Poverty will exacerbate risk. Mitigation efforts, such as the use of air conditioners, will tax the electrical grid, and the heat exhaust of air conditioners will feed back to maintain or increase the temperature, lowering the amount of moisture needed to induce heat stroke. Migration will likely increase social conflict, adding to the death toll. And multiple social pathways threaten to reduce harvests, lead to poor food distribution, famine, and death. Many people implicitly view the climate as simply the background for the stage on which humans act. But human effects on climate and climate impacts on humans should disabuse us of this notion. Instead, human practices, such as where to live, how to live, and what to expect, are interimbricated with climate conditions. And the climate is such a complex system, with much we do not yet understand, that new climate science discoveries often reveal even more threats to human flourishing. Alas, the threats may escalate as we integrate our knowledge of the social world into estimates of future climate trajectories. The mix of climate science and social science may be more frightening than reassuring. Yet, bringing sociological insights into climate science may offer the most promising path to realizing the risks our past and present actions have placed before us, before it is too late. That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.